10 years, that's how long it's been since the attack on that very French institution, Charlie Hebdo, the targeting of the satirical weekly, and the silencing on the day of 12 staff plus bystanders and 2 police officers. That attack would launch a wave of jihadist terror on French soil and spark a slogan that would go global. In 2025, what does it mean to post "Je suis Charlie," I am Charlie? How has that evolved since that massive demonstration we saw back then in Paris, where some 40 world leaders attended, and where in a very rare moment of national unity, crowds even cheered the police? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking how far satire can go today. Joining us from Jerusalem, cartoonist Michel Kishka, a member of Cartooning for Peace, which has commemorated with honor and gusto this commemoration. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you too.
Gabriel Atanzio is Associate Professor of English at the Sorbonne Law School, a high school teacher in a previous life. We've talked about these issues before. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Emma Kate Simons, your piece on Charlie 10 years on is in the New European. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
And from Palermo in Italy, Nasira Ghanif, Professor of Sociology at Paris 8 University. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
You can catch the show or catch up on the show wherever podcasts are streamed. That's a reminder. Yeah, there were not one but 2 ceremonies in Paris this Tuesday, one in the 11th arrondissement where the attacks took place, and also in the east of the capital, where 4 died in a separate attack on a kosher supermarket. Emerald Maxwell looks back on those days of January 2015.
These journalists ran to the roof of their building after gunshots ran out from the nearby offices of Charlie Hebdo. 2 men had stepped out of a black Citroën. First, they shot dead Frédéric Boisseau, a building maintenance worker, and then stormed the 2nd floor of Charlie Hebdo's offices during a morning editorial meeting. They killed Charb, the editor-in-chief, as well as cartoonists Wolinski, Tinius, Cabu, 2 other members of staff, and a man who, by unhappy chance, was visiting that day. This in a military-style attack. The assailants managed to escape the first officers who arrived at the scene by opening fire on them. They drove off and ran into 42-year-old policeman Ahmed Merabet patrolling on his bicycle. He tried to stop them, but his pistol was no match for their Kalashnikovs, and he was shot dead. The attackers' shouts could be heard as they escaped. 12 people died that day, and brothers Sherif and Said Kouachi, identified by documents left in one of the cars, became the most wanted men in France. Early on Thursday morning, a man later identified as Amdi Koulibaly, close to the Kouachi brothers, opened fire in Montrouge, a suburb south of Paris, killing 27-year-old Clarissa Jean-Philippe, a rookie police officer. Later that day, authorities announced that the Charlie Hebdo suspects had robbed a petrol station 100 kilometers northeast of Paris. 88,000 police officers were deployed to hunt them down. On Friday, the Kouachi brothers dumped their stolen car in the industrial suburb of Dammartin-en-Goële. Pursued by police, they holed up inside a print workshop with the owner and an employee who was hiding. Around 1 p.m., news of another hostage situation emerged. The Montrouge killer had resurfaced. Inside a kosher supermarket in eastern Paris, Koulibaly shot 4 people, all Jewish, and took the other customers hostage, threatening to kill them too if the Kouachi brothers were killed. At 5 p.m., the Kouachi brothers were killed in a hail of bullets as they stormed out of the print shop. And just a few minutes later, Koulibaly was killed in the supermarket. France's 3 days of terror were over. That Sunday, nearly 4 million people and 50 heads of state took to the streets in a march for free speech. Amid their chants, "Je suis Charlie," I am Charlie.
Michel Kishka, you paid tribute to one of those cartoonists killed. Cabu, whose fame in France was in part due to his years as an in-house cartoonist for a popular children's show on French public television. His death really rocked all of France. You see in this cover that we showed there It lists all the other attacks that followed there, including against a middle school teacher, Samuel Paty, who had shown cartoons of the Prophet to his social studies class, and to another teacher more recently, Dominique Bernard. And there you have the caption, "It's tough being assassinated by, I'll say it politely, by idiots." Michel Kishka, your thoughts on how you remember that day of January 7th, 2015?
Oh, that was a day I will never forget. I was in Jerusalem at my working place when I heard that something was happening in Charlie Hebdo headquarters in Paris. And I opened the TV, I watched the French channels, and immediately I wrote a personal mail to my friend Tinius, who was one of the 5 cartoonists who was assassinated, and I simply asked him, "Tell me that you are okay." And actually, he never answered me, and that was the day that a lot of cartoonists that I know in the world, and mainly in the Francophone world, consider that was the 9/11 of the cartoon world. This is the thing that we knew, that they were threatened, that they were fatwa against some cartoonists after the publications of the Muhammad cartoons in 2006. We never imagined, and they were protected, that they would come to be such a massacre of 12 people in Charlie Hebdo, and the day after, as you showed us before, a policeman, and then 4 Jewish clients of a supermarket on the Friday. That was something that we could not imagine that would ever happen. And I was personally very much afraid that that would be the end of Charlie Hebdo, because those who were assassinated, 3 of them were the founders, and they were over 80. Okay, and I was reading them and laughing with their cartoons since I was a teenager. So I'm glad at least that they found the strength to rebuild themselves with a new team, and that they have been protected by the laws of France and by the Republic, secular Republic, when they were taken to court by the Islamic Muslims of France. But still, they all live with bodyguards, and their life is not normal, and France have a lot of difficulties to protect them and to make their laws respected. So it's true that in the world, a lot of people asked, is cartooning had become a dangerous job? It's not a dangerous job. It's not a dangerous job, but today the world had definitely changed. And when you draw, you need to think well of how you say things, how you draw things, and keeping.
So do you self-censor a little more than you would have before?
No. I must confess that I have been asked this question a lot of times. My reaction was that if I censorship myself more than when I was using to, because each of us is doing that, it would be a victory for terror. So I have decided, in respect and in memory of my friends who were assassinated, to try to go as far as I can go in my cartoons, and never to give up, and never being afraid. But the difference between, and it's important for the people who are watching us, between Charlie Hebdo and, let's say, the main press cartoonist, is that Charlie Hebdo was and is still an independent, satirical weekly magazine, and who refused to publish any advertising because they don't want to depend on the money of the publishers, who would influence the line of the editorial cartoons. So they are very free, very independent. They live in a democracy. They are protected by laws, and they are also, let's say, in the tradition of the strong spirit of the French cartoons, who were developed in the late 60s, after 68.
Let's
So
talk about that. Let's talk about that tradition for a moment, because
Mhm.
you mentioned a moment ago how you were afraid. Would Charlie Hebdo survive after so many of its
Yes.
key staff members were wiped out? Emma Kate Simons, I can remember friends of mine whose political leanings were not at all what Charlie Hebdo is. Left wing, anarchist to a degree, and who took subscriptions back then to Charlie Hebdo to show their solidarity, even though it wasn't their cup of tea. I'm going to give you the unenviable task of explaining to our international audience exactly what is Charlie Hebdo.
So, well, yeah, it is an unenviable task, but I'm happy to take it on, having read so much and written quite a lot about Charlie Hebdo and having followed what happened here 10 years ago. But it was founded in the 1970s. It really is anchored in this anti-clerical, irreverent, satirical French tradition of the caricature, going back centuries, actually, caricaturing kings, caricaturing the rich, caricaturing the pompous and the religious. And so really...
And with the religious at the beginning,
Yes,
that
with
mostly
the
means
Catholics.
priests, right?
Yes, it was the Catholics, the princes of the church, and that evolved later into caricaturing other religions. But really, the bread and butter of Charlie Hebdo has always been political figures, moneyed figures. And obviously, there's a tradition of caricature in the English-speaking world as well, in the United States and the United Kingdom, but it was particularly pronounced in France. And as you say, there was this sort of semi-anarchist, quite... wild left wing, but not at all categorizable kind of point of view, but anti-authoritarian, anti-establishment, and funny. So these people, like, you know, as they say in English, they made fun. They made fun of the pompous and the powerful, and they enjoyed what they were doing. And in France, they had a lot more leeway than perhaps in other countries.
So the problem, Gabrielle Latanzio, is we now live in a globalized world. You're in the United States when the attacks happen.
I was.
And the jokes, even though they're a lot of them are cartoons, they don't translate very well, because what Emma Kate just described is difficult to explain.
Right. So I was in Washington, D.C. at the time, where I spent a year doing some research in American history. And I remember conversations I had with colleagues or friends that worked in international relations. And what struck me is how French I was. I don't think I realized before, in truth, how much of my thinking was French. I'm not sure I understood perfectly what happened in 2015. Now, 10 years after, I certainly understand how high the stakes are regarding terrorism in France. But I knew a lot of people in the US looked at the story of Charlie Hebdo, and one of their first concerns was just how Islamophobic the publication was. And most of my conversations were about just how hateful the publication is. I remember that. And to me, and I was not too comfortable with the discussion back then. I certainly am even less now, because I do think there's no way to contextualize in a way that would make sense of the killing. You know, and I don't think my friends or colleagues meant to do that either. But from outside, the lack of deference that French cartoonists or French journalists might have towards the powerful is certainly something that we've had to cherish, and we still have to cherish. And that is something that Americans might not understand necessarily.
Yeah, this top-down rule that we have in France, Nassira Ghenif, with a right to play the jester. When you think back then how difficult it was for an international audience to understand what Charlie Hebdo was, your thoughts on looking back?
Well, actually, I also have my own memory of where I was and what was happening precisely on January 7. I was traveling back from abroad, and my children were trying to contact me because they were afraid that I would be caught in what had just happened, and that it was maybe spreading across not just the area where Charlie Hebdo was taking place, but way beyond, which would happen 2 days later, as we all know now. And the other thing that I wanted to share is the fact that before 2015, the debate had been very tight about how to handle the question of freedom of expression. And to me, there was something that should be we should make the difference between the fact that cartoonists have the freedom to express themselves and the fact that the readers and the viewers have also the right to feel uncomfortable with what they are showing. And this is exactly what happened with the publication of the Muhammad cartoons in 2006. And I could see the difference of feeling between the conversation that was taking place in France and presentations that I did as an academic in Denmark, in Copenhagen, and then in the US at Ann Arbor, Michigan University. And I could sense that things that were still open in terms of discussion were making people feel uncomfortable in Copenhagen about discussing the cartoons, and again in Ann Arbor at the university. And this was very striking for me because I felt that I could show as an academic the cartoons to explain the debate and the dissensus that was taking place in France, while some of my colleagues, US or from other nationalities, felt uncomfortable by the fact that I would show the cartoons themselves. So that says something about the fact that the discomfort was not just taking place in France. This was an international debate about how far you can go and how you can address the fact that you are maybe sometimes being disrespectful to people who believe in God or to Muslims. And this has triggered a conversation about Islamophobia that never ended up until today. We're still in this kind of debate, and we haven't solved it in any way because Islamophobia have become something completely mainstream most of the time in France.
But that was actually the word Islamophobia was the word that was used basically to justify the murder of these cartoonists and writers. A word that actually should mean fear of Islam, which was turned into actually a word meaning hatred of Islam or hatred of people who are Muslims or even a racism, when that's actually not what the word means. But I think that you're absolutely right. In the United Kingdom, for example, just a week after the attacks, when the Survivors edition came out with a very soft cartoon on the cover of Muhammad crying, saying, "All is forgiven, je suis Charlie." My editor at Frontières, Caroline Forrest, was interviewed by Sky News in the United Kingdom, and she tried to show the cover during her interview and got summarily cut off by a very, very smiling presenter. And they ended the interview and said, "We have decided that is our policy. We won't show." And this is only a week after the killings, when millions of people around the world were actually in solidarity. There was a rare moment, actually, of global solidarity. People really did say, "Je suis Charlie." Mark Zuckerberg came out in support. There were 8 million copies of this first edition sold. So there was a brief moment of consensus. But you're absolutely right that very quickly, these old accusations that actually kill and can be misconstrued and used as a kind of fatwa were levelled again at Charlie Hebdo or any French journalist or other who wanted to publish the cartoons. And sadly, that fear has returned. And you'll see this week, there's not that we should be rushing out to publish Muhammad cartoons as necessarily needed to be done in 2006 as an act of solidarity with the Danish cartoonists. It's not that, but there's a clear fear that you're going to offend, even though a few months ago, Charlie Hebdo published a cover or a cartoon of the Virgin Mary that utterly offended some Catholics in the Catholic Church. And in fact, most of the covers are not about religion or even about Islam or about Islamic fundamentalists.
All right, for many in France, there's the enduring shock of the violent attack. And there's also the memory, though, of that brief moment of national unity that followed. Siobhan Silk has more on that.
The 11th of January 2011, just days after the attack on Charlie Hebdo and the kosher supermarket, more than 4 million people marched in Paris with a simple message: no to terrorism, yes to peace and tolerance. On that day,
All right. Apologies for the problem with the technical problem with that report. Gabriel Attencio, there was this moment of this brief moment of a national unity. It didn't last.
No, it has not. And you can see some studies that are quite optimistic, but not necessarily for the whole of the French population. Some people will tell you that we have 3 people out of 4 that are in favor of free speech right now. 3 people out of 4 means 1 out of 4 that is not in favor of free speech. What is most worrisome, in my opinion, as someone who has spent some time with the youth, for the past 15 years as a professional, is that I can tell that not everyone understands the very purpose of French secularism. Not everyone understands the very purpose of defending our values, such as free speech and others. François, earlier you asked a question. You said, what does it mean to say, I am Charlie today? I do think it's the most important question. And I do think that if we forget, terrorists will remind us, as they have. I'm here as a teacher.
So what does it mean saying, je suis Charlie? What does it mean?
The right to exist in the face of hatred. That's what it is, truly. In 2020, as you all know right now, sure, and have fun, of course. To exist means to laugh and enjoy life.
Power, about fundamentalism.
People who watch the show know, in 2020, a French teacher was killed because he talked about Charlie Hebdo. In 2023, a teacher was killed, Dominique Bernard, because he was associated with another teacher who showed the caricatures as well. That was 2023. This is not so long ago. I would like to hear the case of people who think that it might not happen again. I can't make that case myself. I do believe that when we talk about Charlie right now, we're talking about being vigilant and protecting those who defend free speech and critical thinking. That's what it's truly about.
May I add something?
Sure, Nassira Ghanif, please.
Yes. I think that we all agree on the fact that we have to defend freedom of speech, and especially to stand by principles that are in the law in France, like laïcité, like freedom of speech, like freedom of expression, and academic freedom to add to it. The problem is that we do have laws now that are against freedom of expression, that are criminalizing certain kind of expressions because they are supposed to be apologetic for terrorism. And we have seen that time and again during the past year with relation to what is happening, the genocide in Gaza. So I completely agree, but I'm afraid that there has been laws that have been voted since 2015 that act against the defense of freedom of speech. We all know
many
now
would differ
that exception, yes, probably.
Well, they say it's an incitement to hatred and to terrorism. It's different.
Nassira Ghanif.
If I may finish, yes, thank you. First, exception measures that were implemented in 2015 have become the common law in 2017 through the election of Emmanuel Macron. We all know also that are laws like the one about fighting against separatism, or there has been this law about global security that all included measures that restricted not only freedom of expression, but also targeted journalists in their own work. And there had to be demonstrations on the street in order to make sure that this law would not be implemented. So I'm speaking to the fact that it's not just Islamists that are threatening the freedom of expression, but it's because we are in a state of anti-terrorism state that sometimes we go too far and beyond the pale, and we threaten the freedom of expression that we cherish so much.
All right, let's talk a minute ago. Gabriel was talking about what the views are today of the French. Well, for that, and to find out just how Charlie France is, let's bring on Emerald Maxwell, who's been poring over surveys. Emerald, how much free speech do the French want?
Well, François, it's splashed defiantly across the front page of Charlie Hebdo today. It says increvable or indestructible, with this poll that says that 76% of French people are for the support to the freedom to caricature. And it might surprise some to say here that that's actually more people that support it than before. Sorry, it's more people support it now than before that terror attack. So as we can see, back in September 2012, 58% of French people agreed that freedom of expression is a fundamental right and that the freedom of caricature is part of that. That's compared to 76% in June 2024. This, by the way, is from a poll of 1,000 French people who were surveyed in a nationally representative sample. Similarly, while in 2012, 35% of people said that you can't just say in caricature just anything under the guise of freedom of expression. That has, in June 2024, fewer people agreed with that statement, just 24% overall. The survey also asked whether people were in favour of the freedom to criticise or poke fun at religion, which is protected in a July 1881 French law. Again, the number of people who approved of the law has actually gone up since 2012 from 50 to 62%, while those against it has fallen from 50 to 38%. And this does seem to show that the important legacy of Charlie Hebdo and a society that's increasingly in tune with its long-standing fight for the right to criticise or poke fun at just about anything and everything. And that spirit is also reflected in what French people think about the New York Times decision back in 2019 to stop running political cartoons. That was after one of its cartoons caused uproar and was accused of being anti-Semitic. Only 34% of French people approve of this decision, while 66% disapprove. As ever, though, the devil is in the detail in this survey, which also reveals a generational disparity on several of these questions. For example, while just 21% of those aged 35 and over say that you cannot publish just anything under the guise of freedom of expression, that number rises to 32%, or nearly a third of people under the age of 35. And we also see that generational disparity when it comes to the New York Times decision to stop publishing political cartoons. We can see that 42% of under 35s approve of that decision. That compares to 29% of over 65s who approve. So although overall the headline figure is rosy for the freedom to caricature or the freedom of expression, French people in general do seem to hold it dear. The tide looks like it could still be turning, with younger people more inclined to protect sensitivities at the expense of freedom of expression. Lastly, another difference we see, and perhaps unsurprisingly, is that support for the freedom to caricature or to blaspheme falls among religious people, with 53% of Muslims and 59% of Catholics saying they are in favour of this freedom. And that's, of course, compared to the 3/4 of French people overall.
Many thanks for that, Emerald Maxwell. Michel Kischke, you penned a cartoon at the start of the year depicting Paris's Place de la République, which was the rallying point for that big march that took place. And you have a cartoonist on the top saying, "Je suis Charlie," and the others are, "Well, I'm not Charlie. I used to be Charlie." You have a sense, even though that survey shows that the number of people in favor of freedom of expression has grown, that actually it's wavering. What makes you feel like that?
Listen, the one who is still Charlie with the red shirt is me, is myself. Okay, and this is something that I is so important for me in my work, is to stay, let's say, so close to my friends who have been assassinated in such a cruel way, and to respect their work. But among the things that were said by the other people around, I think that what is happening is that Charlie Hebdo is a symptom of what is happening to the press, to the freedom of press. And it's a very, let's say, I'm very worrying about the symptoms around, because since Charlie Hebdo, or since the beginning of the 21st century, a lot of my colleagues have been fired from their newspaper, have been threatened. Some of them have been assassinated. Some of them found themselves with no work, and some of them had to leave the country and to look for exile, to be refugee in another country. And there's something around the freedom of press who is changing, because the press now is in the hands of very rich and strong people who want to control so many things, and cartoon is just a little part of it.
Yeah, political cartoonists can be a precarious vocation, Michel. We saw it just this past weekend. A cartoonist, Ann Telness from the Washington Post, who quit after the owner, Jeff Bezos, who also owns Amazon, was depicted in this cartoon where you have corporate titans who are showing their loyalty to the president-elect of the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. and it's because he's the owner of the Washington Post, and he could impose his view to the editor, to the publisher, and she decided to quit. And she had been working for the Washington Post till 2008, and she's very talented, and she's also very courageous. She's an example and a model for all of the cartoonists that I know. But you know, people have to understand that a cartoon is not a joke. A cartoon is actually an editorial, an opinion editorial drawn. And because it's drawn, and because it's visual, and because the impact on the eye of the reader is immediate, so it afraids people. Because if you have to read an opinion editorial, it takes 3, 5, 10 minutes. It depends how long it is. A cartoon, half a second is enough to get it, to get the point. And this is why I think people are afraid.
But Michel, isn't it, and you heard earlier Emma Kate saying political cartoonists, there's a history going back to the 18th century even.
Yes.
Isn't it also that everybody's in favor of this freedom of speech until they're the butt of the joke? Let me give an example. Back in 2016, Charlie Hebdo shocked Italians with a cartoon that followed an earthquake in central Italy that killed nearly 300. Broadsheet of record there, Corriere della Sera wrote, quote, "Today, yes, no one is Charlie." Your thoughts on that?
Okay. But you know what? There's also some bad taste, okay, in this tradition of satirical, very exaggerated satirical cartoons. And but is it a reason to be assassinated? To make a bad taste joke or to draw one? So I would not rule such a thing, but I think that what is happening is actually that Charlie Hebdo's case is a sort of barometer of the health of democracy. Because, you know, in France there are 66 million people. Charlie Hebdo has around 30,000 readers. It's a very small magazine. It cannot hurt 66 million people, and no one is obliged to buy it. It's not like having a show on TV that you watch and you can't even zap. No, you have to decide. You take €3 out of your pocket and you buy this magazine because you want to buy it. And if you don't like it, don't buy it. But don't assassinate my friends.
Is freedom of speech lessened as it was 10 years ago? You heard Nassira Ghanif saying she thinks so. Gabrielle Latentio?
I'm not sure. I think the conversation we're having is global, and we should understand that liberal values are not a majority viewpoint. I think that's also what we should focus on. The idea that we all agree that there should be freedoms for all, and that we start with the individual, etc., and so on. It's really a minority viewpoint worldwide, and I do think we have to defend it. We're talking about the law. What is the law? How do you regulate it? What do you say when something is wrong? I work at the Sorbonne Law School. And most of my work is about history and explaining the language, etc., and so on. You can regulate speech not through laws, but through guns, which is exactly what some did, and which is why we need to be unanimous in condemning it. Or you can regulate it with morals or with rumors, gossip. What do you think about this? I myself, my name is Latentio. I don't find this drawing particularly tasteful, but I'm certainly happy that
from Italy, yeah.
Sure. So, but I certainly have nothing against. I would never say we should censor it in any way. That's what truly matters.
And what was your thought when you saw Emerald's breaking down for us what that survey
Right.
said? The fact that young people, the ones who are the generation that's on
Yes.
social media, is both at the same time more in favor of anything goes, and at the same time.
Yes, that's exactly
a little
it,
bit
François.
pushing back.
Exactly. So that's the issue. For young people, it's hard to differentiate between morality and legality, right? That's a conversation we've had here when we discussed the killing of Samuel Paty and others. If you want to signal your belief that something is good, sometimes there will be confusion as to what should be the rule enforced by state authorities. and what should be permissible otherwise, and leave the state out of it, etc., and so on. If you want to signal your virtue, if you want to say, look, I'm in favor of preserving the emotion of my classmates, for instance, of course, but that does not mean that the state itself should enforce and make sure that everyone's feelings are always protected in any time. The truth is, especially for a classroom, you will never learn a thing if you believe that you should always feel safe. That's not true. You need to be challenged. You need to question yourself. And that's what, in a very distasteful way, Charlie Hebdo did. Question.
And isn't that what this 10-year anniversary is really fulfilling, that kind of important role? I think even with children and younger people, like educating them about what happened, how important it is to protect free speech. And if you're offended, well, you walk away, you can express your disapproval, but you do that through peaceful means. But I do think we haven't talked about the fact that there's two things going on here. There's the jihadist terrorist threat, which is what in the end led to the murders of the people at Charlie Hebdo, and in the days after, and the attacks at the Hyper Jewish supermarket, and in the weeks and months after, not just in France. But then there is the speech you can never regulate, which is the political speech, which people have the right to utter and express, but which was never on the side of Charlie, and including Jacques Chirac in around the 2006 time of the Danish cartoons. He condemned the fact that it was provocative to do such things. I mean, Charlie Hebdo never had that much support, actually. They got a lot more since 2015, and I think those survey results are actually quite encouraging. To see more than 3/4 of the French, more than before, supporting the right to caricature. A majority of Muslims and Catholics who may have stronger religious sensibilities,
but also
still in favour.
Yeah.
So I think, I'm not sure you'd find the same results. It would be interesting to do the same
Elsewhere.
survey in the United Kingdom, the United States. I'm not convinced it would be the same.
Nassira Ghanif, what's the conversation with your students?
Well, it's very open because, as I said, I do not censor myself. I do not consider that there are things that I cannot show and those that I should show, but I make sure that they are able to get all the kind of information, all the readings they need, and that they can rely on their experience. I wouldn't be as sharp as to say that they do not make the difference between their own feelings and what the law should implement. I think that they know what the law is about, and they know how they should be involved and engaged with all kind of debates and all kind of questions that have to do with discrimination, with racism, with Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and especially everything that has to do with the connection between what goes on with relation to freedom of expression and how it can hurt people. And I think that this is what we have to address in our classes. At least this is what I do. I make sure that the freedom of expression is something that is being used in order to enhance our ability to accept the other as it is, and not as to scapegoat him or her, or as to criminalize other ways of existence and other ways of thinking. So I think this is exactly what we have to do. In many ways, I think there has been this strange conversation in France about those who are against Islamophobia are immediately considered to be against freedom of expression. I think that both go along. In order to fight Islamophobia as it is expanding, not only in France but abroad, one has to cherish and to implement all ways of protecting freedom of expression. And to me, these are tasks that you can do together at the same time. And this is also how you prevent students from being drawn towards this kind of binaries between the good and the bad, the civilization and the barbaric, the Islamists who are all tend to attack and to be terrorists, and the Muslims who are supposed to be the victims also. So we have to be very careful about the way freedom of expression could be used against certain minorities. and not space for them
Islamophobia
to
is used
express themselves.
constantly. It's used constantly to silence critics of Islamist fundamentalism. And in fact, in France, that is the debate. Because in the past 10 years, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the head of the far-left France Unbowed Party, has gone from being a die-hard supporter of Charlie Hebdo, laïcité or secularism and free speech, to today being the first person to tweet about Islamophobia in the context of the Charlie Hebdo and other attacks. So this is a word, and in the United Kingdom, it's also used to silence critics of Islamist extremism. And recently, there was an attempt by a Labour MP to impose a blasphemy law. He called for a blasphemy law in the United Kingdom in the Parliament a few months ago, and he said he wanted to prevent desecration of religious texts, including the Quran. But he did it in the context of the Islamophobia Awareness Week. So it's a term that obviously exists. There is fear of Islam, but it's often misconstrued, misinterpreted, and used in a quite negative and nasty way against people like the
Very briefly, because we're short on time. Nassira Ghanis, one sentence.
Yes, maybe you should grant me some credit in not instrumentalizing the process and the problem of Islamophobia in order to implement some laws against blasphemy or anything else. Instrumentalization does exist, but the phenomenon of Islamophobia does also exist and is very harmful to our societies right now.
All right, Michel Kishka, I want to ask you before we go, how many new friends you've made in Israel, where you are, with one cartoon we can show depicting Benjamin Netanyahu's to-do list, and you see that leaders of Hamas, Hezbollah crossed out on this list, but then towards the bottom it says things like the hostages still being held in Gaza, democracy, justice. How's that gone down?
You know, in Israel, I live in democracy. This democracy is not equal for everybody, and it should be. But at least I can express myself absolutely freely. And when I cartoon, and I also put my cartoon in French and sometimes also in English, when I begin to draw them in Hebrew, so I try to make my work, let's say, to be shared not only among Israelis or Hebrew readers. So I have one voice, I have one way to say the things, I have one language. But about what was said before, I think that there's a very important question of education, because Gabriel and Nassira are also professors, and I have been professor in the art school of Jerusalem, Bezalel, for 40 years. And I had a class of cartoon, and I could see on my students how difficult it is for them to know they have the total freedom to express themselves freely, because this is not the way kids are educated. And it's a thing that you must train, and you must be taught how to use it, or like, what is democracy? What is being a Democrat? What is being tolerant? No one was born democratic. Okay, this is a question of education, and so I think we also have a responsibility that we should take. And as far as I understand, those who are professors take this responsibility with their students, but it should begin in primary school, and it's very important.
And we'll have to leave it there. Before we go, though, 10 years on, our thoughts do go out to the loved ones of one victim in particular of the Charlie Hebdo attacks, Bernard Maris, columnist at Charlie under the cheeky pen name of Oncle Bernard, the always insightful, always generous economist, was a regular guest here at France 24, and one of those victims on the day. Again, our thoughts go out to him. I want to thank you so much, Michel Kishka, for being with us from Jerusalem. I want to thank Nassira Ghanis for joining the conversation from Palermo, Gabrielle Lattanzio, Emma Kate Simons. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.